Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final installment of the 5th Katipunan Conference webinar series. This Zoom event is organized by the Strategic Studies Program of the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies and the Philippine Office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in partnership with the UP Department of Political Science. We would also like to welcome our viewers from Facebook. This session is currently live streaming on the official Facebook page of UP-CIDS. My name is Herman Kraft, and I will be your moderator for today's session. In the past 3 weeks, the previous webinars that we've held actually discussed various themes that are related to the impact of COVID-19 on the strategic environment, including emerging trends in the region, norms and international law in ASEAN, and on conflict and security. And today, for the final session of this webinar series, we will be exploring the projections for the region in a post-COVID-19 scenario. To formally start, let us welcome Professor Dr. Stefan Yost, the Country Director of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines, to give the introductory remarks. Professor Yost, please.
Yeah, good morning, Herman. Thank you very much. First of all, on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, welcome all of you to the 5th Katipunan Conference, COVID-19 and the strategic environment, change and continuity, and today reading the tea leaves, future developments in the region. It's Konrad Adenauer is a German political foundation with a Christian democratic orientation. And we are working in 107 offices all over the world with national and regional programs. The Philippines were one of the first countries where the foundation started its work in Asia in 1964. Strengthening of democratic political systems, rule of law, human rights, an inclusive economical system as a social market economy are some of our most important working areas. Another focus of our work, including our office in the Philippines, is questions of international relations and security policy. The structures and functioning of the international system and international relations were already undergoing profound changes before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Central questions of this change were, on the one hand, whether and if so, in what form and to what extent the United States of America under the presidency of Trump would be able and willing to continue its dominant role in international politics. On the other hand, the question of how the relationship between these two states would develop in view of the rise of China and its increasing claim to power, and what the effects on the international power structure would be. And related to this is the question of how others, especially regional powers, would orient themselves in this constellation. Among the many questions is what impact the intensifying US-China rivalry will have on the Indo-Pacific, in particular on the ASEAN and within ASEAN on the Philippines. There is no question that the global COVID-19 pandemic has significantly accelerated many of these ongoing developments and changes. And it's obvious that one state in particular is doing everything it can to exploit this international crisis to the utmost for its power and geopolitical interests. Irrespective of the changes in perceptions and assessments that had already become apparent, this has contributed significantly to the fact that the entire region has increasingly come into the focus of other states and regions. That applies to the European Union, but it is also and especially applies to Germany. A few weeks ago, for example, the German government first formulated guidelines for the Indo-Pacific region. This concept makes it very clear how important the entire region is for Germany, I would add, but also for Europe. And it develops a broad concept for future forms of cooperation. Today's title speaks for itself, reading the tea leaves. In Germany, in such a case, we only speak in passing of reading in coffee grounds. So different cultures, comparable admonitions and proverbs. And indeed, Even there are a lot of recognizable questions on the table. The answers are far from being given. A lot is open and in flux. But that is precisely why it is so important to observe these developments carefully, to analyze them and to exchange ideas from different perspectives. And what could be better for this than the Katipunan Conference? The Katipunan Conference has been in the past years considered as a well-known debate platform centered on issues involving prominent foreign and security policy issues in the region. The constant exchange between scientists and politicians is deemed significant for foreign and security policy analysis because it aids in the assessment on the consequences of recent developments in the region of the Philippines. This interaction allows a timely opportunity to enable the realization and development of own strategies. Hence, dialogue forums such as the Katipunan Conference serves as a vital instrument in the exchange of both national and international experiences and opinions towards the creation of concrete political concepts. My thanks therefore go to Professor Hermann Josef Kraft and his staff from the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies for this excellent initiative. I'm pleased and very grateful that we have one internationally recognized expert to discuss these exciting questions today. My warm welcome and thank you therefore go out to our national and international experts, to Her Excellency Ambassador Anke Reifenstiel, Ambassador from Germany, Professor Brendan Tyler, Strategic and Defense Studies Center from the Australian National University, and Assistant Secretary Geneva Mahilim West, Office of Asean Affairs, Department of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for being with us today. And finally, I would like to say thank you to Rona Villanueva from my staff from the CAS office here in Manila for supporting the preparation of this event. Thank you to all of you for your participation, and again, a warm welcome to all of you. And now I'm looking forward to interesting presentations, lots of insights, and an exciting discussion. Thank you very much, and maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yost. Indeed, this is a webinar that we really look forward to. And one of the things that we were concerned about was the effects of the typhoon on whether this webinar was actually going to push through today. But in any case, we are now online, and I'd like to inform you that our Zoom attendees that they can use the Q&A button to send in their questions for the open forum. Please make sure to identify the speaker to whom you're actually addressing your question. And our attendees from the live Facebook may also send their questions through the comment section, and we will try to address them during the open forum. Now, it is my pleasure to actually introduce our speakers for today. We have a very an excellent panel with our first speaker being Her Excellency Anke Reifenstiel, who is the Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Republic of the Philippines. The ambassador has worked in the diplomatic service since 1993, with postings that include the German embassies in London, New Delhi, and Cairo, before finally being assigned to Manila in August 2019. Our second speaker is Assistant Secretary Geneva M. Mahilum West, who is actually the head of the Office of Asean Affairs in the Department of Foreign Affairs here in the Philippines. Her postings included the Philippine embassies in Paris, Toronto, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And last but not the least, our third speaker is Dr. Brendan Taylor, who is actually a very good friend, a professor of strategic studies and deputy director of the Coral Bell University of specialization, our great power strategic relations in the Asian economic sanctions and regional security architecture. And with that, may I invite Ambassador Anke Reifenstiel to actually start with the proceedings. Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Professor Kraft, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Good morning, Professor Jost. Assistant Secretary Juniper and Professor Brandon Taylor, distinguished guest, Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat, and good morning. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the reality and the coordinates of life for all of us at a global level and in all sectors of life. Political, economic, social, private, etc. Maybe not only temporarily, but sustainably. The pandemic has demonstrated how globally interconnected and interdependent nations, economies, and people are today. When the shock of the pandemic hit us at the beginning of the year, almost every country immediately decided to lock down, to close its borders in order to protect its own population from the spread of the virus. However, we had to learn very quickly that such national isolation does not work, at least not for a longer period of time. Fortunately, mutual solidarity at bilateral, European, regional, and international level came up rather fast, providing funding or in-kind support for an effective COVID response has become an important element in the German and European relations with Asian countries and the world. Apart from providing several million euro funding for international organizations like IOM or the International Committee of the Red Cross or CSO COVID response programs in the Philippines, the German government has also agreed to adjust ongoing projects in other sectors and to and to increase the flexibility for the use of the funds that had been provided in order to use parts of the funds to address COVID-related challenges. We should understand this crisis as an opportunity to strengthen the global community by a sustainable, multilateral, United Nations-based approach to finding solutions jointly, including developing a vaccine, but also by approaching response programs jointly. At the same time, other areas of the bilateral relations seem to be under pressure. With the global economic slowdown or even recession, also German companies and enterprises have been heavily affected. The bilateral trade between Germany and the Philippines has seen a considerable downtrend. Investments have been paused or slowed down. The movement of people, for instance, for trade fairs or business negotiations, have been halted as well. Cultural events and academic exchanges have not taken place since March, or at least not physically, but only virtually. I'm very glad that with the Cine Europa film festival that will start this weekend at the SM Mall of Asia here in Manila in the drive-in cinema, we are able to feed the appetite for cultural events again. Of course, we are proud that the opening movie of the festival is a German movie. The area of political relations between our two countries has not really been affected by the pandemic. On the contrary, after the first meeting, high-level meeting took place 2 years ago in Berlin, we held the second round of high-level bilateral political consultations last week in a virtual format. We had a very fruitful and very frank exchange on all kinds of areas of current cooperation, as well as on potential for expanding it. And the leitmotif of these consultations really was to explore how to best fill with life and how to implement the Indo-Pacific policy guidelines that have recently been adopted by the German government, as it has just been mentioned by Dr. Jost in his introductory remarks. I think it does not come as a surprise that cooperation on climate change related issues was identified as an important area for continued cooperation in the bilateral political consultations of last week. The Indo-Pacific policy guidelines constitute the framework for our work and cooperations not only with the Philippines, but with all the countries in this part of the world. Our key concern is to set up new partnerships and to strengthen existing ones, as well as to maximize the potential for new cooperation. The policy guidelines comprise a vast array for future cooperation, collaboration in mutual organizations and structures such as ASEAN or the United Nations, addressing root causes and impacts of climate change, promoting peace and security in the region, promoting human rights and the rule of law, strengthening international free trade, working on connectivity and digitalization, as well as enhancing cultural and academic relations and exchange. With these policy guidelines in these areas for potential cooperation, we, the German government, aim at broadening the perspective and partnerships with the countries in Asia and the Indo-Pacific region in general. With the guidelines, we are setting out a course for Germany's future policy on the countries in the region. The guidelines affirm our shared resolve to engage even more actively as an actor and as a partner, and to help maintain the rules-based order here. The guidelines provide a coherent policy framework for the German government's numerous ongoing as well as planned measures and projects in the Indo-Pacific region. In the past few years, the importance of the Indo-Pacific region, both in economic and in political terms, has increased remarkably. With the rise of Asia, the political and economic balance is increasingly shifting towards the Indo-Pacific region. This region accounts for almost half of the global GDP. At the same time, the strategic competition in the region is increasing. Shifting geopolitical power structures in the Indo-Pacific have a direct impact on Germany and Europe at large. Our economies are closely connected through global supply chains. Major trading routes pass through the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Pacific. Open markets and free trade are crucial for Germany as a trading nation. The share of the broader region, including South and East Asia, and Germany's trade balance has risen steadily in recent decades and now amounts to around 20% of our total trade in goods. The cooperation with the countries of the Indo-Pacific region, be it bilateral, regional, or in the multilateral context, is of increasing importance for us. Therefore, we want to pay more attention to working with our partners in this region of the world and expand cooperation. Our trade with the countries in this region is conducted primarily by sea, through the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, but of course, Germany's interests go far beyond the economic area. Stability and security in the Indo-Pacific region are important for us as well. The countries of this region are heavily affected by climate change, another area where we see a huge potential for partnership. In addition, the region has an upcoming science and research sector and boasts a very rich culture, which attracts great interest in Europe. As an international active trading nation and proponent of a rules-based international order, Germany has a great interest in participating in Asia's growth dynamics and in being involved in shaping the Indo-Pacific region, as well as in upholding global norms in regional structures. These are only few of the reasons why Germany decided to open a new chapter of cooperation with the Indo-Pacific region, as well as with ASEAN and its member states in particular. Germany and the ASEAN member states form relations based on partnership and common interests. This is all the more the case for the European Union, which is why it is high time that the EU and ASEAN become full-fledged strategic partners. And this is one of the issues we have put at the center of our EU Council chairmanship program, as Germany being currently the chair of the EU Council. In the coming years, Germany will strategically position itself and step up its engagement vis-à-vis ASEAN. We will expand our cooperation with ASEAN institutions, continue to support the ASEAN Secretariat, and strengthen the role of the EU as a partner of ASEAN in close cooperation with our EU partners. To this end, we will spare no effort to fill the new strategic partnership between ASEAN and the EU with life and substance, including a more substantial contribution to security and stability. We are committed to safeguarding the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region. This is particularly true for supporting a substantive and legally binding code of conduct for the South China Sea, based on the principles of the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS. At the same time, we must not forget that economic growth has also led to rising emissions, which are a burden on both the global climate and our planet's ecosystems. In the interest of future generations, we must ensure that growth is environmentally friendly and socially compatible. Moreover, natural resources must be managed sustainably, unique biodiversity preserved, and the challenges of urbanization must be addressed. Last but not least, in order to tackle the common challenge for the world's climate, we intend to step up our cooperation with partners in the Indo-Pacific region in all aspects of climate policy, from adaptation to climate change, protection of biodiversity, to promoting renewable energies and energy efficiency. We will look for collaboration and offer our assistance to substantially reduce emissions in line with overall efforts of the European Union to achieve climate commitments with partners in the region which go beyond the current obligations. We will also increase bilateral and regional cooperation to reduce marine litter and to protect marine ecosystems. So overall, we hope that by opening this new chapter of cooperation, we will be able to contribute to a secure, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region with ASEAN as a central player. Thank you.
Much, Madam Ambassador. We invite Assistant Secretary Mahilong West to now give her presentation. Madam Secretary, Assistant Secretary, when you're ready, please.
Do you hear me clearly? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I thank all the divisions of the Office of ASEAN Affairs in the Department of Foreign Affairs, especially Division 2, for crafting our presentation today. And it's very nice to join a panel of true experts in the person of Ambassador Anke Reifenstuhl of Germany, Professor Brendan Taylor of Australia, and of course, the UP Center. Next slide, please. This is just a brief outline of my presentation today. The first part will focus on how ASEAN is responding and adapting to the challenges brought about by the pandemic. The second part will discuss efforts made by the regional group to come up with a recovery plan. And lastly, we shall devote some time to discuss future developments and issues important to the region. Next slide, please. So from face to, this sounds very technical, F2F simply means face-to-face meetings, to VCF. So this is one way of ASEAN adapting to the new situation. ASEAN has been able to continue its engagements despite the limitations caused by the crisis under the able and adept chairmanship of Vietnam. Vietnam's theme this year of cohesive and responsive ASEAN is being lived up to. The lockdowns imposed early in the year and the uncertainties caused by the overall pandemic situation led to the postponement of several scheduled engagements this year. However, important meetings, including high-level ones, pushed through via video conferencing. For the most part, COVID-19 added impetus to having the meetings online as pandemic response and recovery was high on the agenda. The meetings included the 36th ASEAN Summit in June and the 53rd ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting and related ministerial meetings in September. The 37th ASEAN Summit and related summits are scheduled to be held in mid-November. Next slide, please. This is just a brief a summarized table of the incidence of COVID-19 in the ASEAN region. All ASEAN member states have reported cases of COVID-19, and this table with data as of October 23, 2020 from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. shows cases in ASEAN countries compared with those in China and the United States, and with global figures. Very interesting would be, of course, the number of deaths as presented in the table, cases per million, as well as cases in the last 24 hours. So we expect this to be updated later, but this was the latest we could get as of October 23. Vietnam's deliverables this year, as chairman this year, include the following: the midterm review of the ASEAN blueprints, second, ASEAN Community Vision post-2025, third, review of the implementation of the ASEAN Charter, fourth, enhanced display of the ASEAN flag and use of the ASEAN anthem for higher visibility for ASEAN, and fifth, Mekong sub-regional development. And the new priorities added, of course, because of COVID-19 include the following: the COVID-19 Response Fund, which was just established, and the mechanism for the transfer of funds refined. And then we have the ASEAN Regional Reserve of Medical Supplies for Public Health Emergencies, and also an ASEAN Standard Handbook, ASEAN Standard Operating Procedures for Public Health Emergencies. Next would be the ASEAN Center for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases for Future Resilience, and the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Next slide, please. Of course, there's much focus on the ASEAN health sector's existing health mechanisms, which include the ASEAN Emergency Operations Center Network for Public Health Emergencies, led by Malaysia, the ASEAN +3 Field Epidemiology Training Network. The third is the ASEAN Biodiaspora Virtual Center, led by the Philippines. And then we also have the ASEAN Risk Assessment and Risk Communication Center. And lastly, the Regional Public Health Laboratories Network. Just to enumerate some of ASEAN's engagements pertinent to COVID-19, we have had this special ASEAN Summit on COVID-19 last April. Then the special ASEAN +3. +3 means China, Japan, and Korea. ASEAN +3 Summit on COVID-19, same date. The ASEAN Defense Minister's Statement on Defense Cooperation Against Disease Outbreaks, which shows that all pillars are on board in dealing with COVID-19. The next was the special ASEAN-China Foreign Ministers meeting on COVID-19. Then the ASEAN Economic Ministers retreat last March. And we established a new body, the ASEAN Coordinating Council Working Group on Public Health Emergencies. So we have added to our alphabet soup with this new mechanism, ACCWG-PHE, which was established in March. And of course, the ASEAN-US meeting on public health emergencies last April. They all focused on the wide-ranging impact of the pandemic. Next slide, please. On pandemic recovery, we'll share with you what our Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Teodoro Locsin, said at the informal ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting last June, that we should not label our recovery as post-pandemic, because now is the time to develop the ASEAN recovery plan. And saying post-pandemic connotes waiting for a vaccine or a cure that is still in the indeterminate future. So recovery must start now, because our responses now could also form part of our recovery efforts. Next slide, please. So just a quick look on the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. It's one of ASEAN's priorities in addressing the effects of the pandemic. And the following are its objectives. One, plot holistic broad strategies on the ASEAN region stages of recovery, from reopening, recovery, towards longer-term resilience. Second, guide sectors to assess, realign, or expedite their work and priorities and undertake new initiatives with more coordination. So coordination is key. Third is provide a reference and set priorities for sectors across pillars of ASEAN and the broader stakeholders, including the private sector and dialogue partners, to coordinate on the reopening of the economy, recovery, and long-term resilience. And the fourth and last one is contribute to the underlying vision of ASEAN 2025, as well as the strengthening of future resilience. So resilience is a constant refrain, engagement of all stakeholders as well. Deputy Secretary General for ASEAN Economic Community, Dr. Aladin Rilio, recently stated that while COVID-19 has started off as a public health crisis, it has evolved into an economic one. Effective response efforts must therefore go beyond the health sector to mitigate the impact on and support the economy and livelihood of the people. In this context, the ACRF, or the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, will serve as a coordinated exit strategy for the region, taking it through the reopening and recovery stages towards longer-term resilience, preparedness, and competitiveness. So here's a small, here's the schedule of the processing of the ACRF. Next slide, please. Let's go back to the previous. The ASEAN Coordinating Council Working Group on Public Health Emergencies will endorse the consolidated draft of ACRF after inputs from the ASEAN member states, as well as the implementation plan to the 28th ASEAN Coordinating Council meeting on November 10, right before the summits. And this is to be for subsequent adoption by the leaders at the 37th summit on 13 November. Next slide, please. So ASEAN in what we call the new normal. Just some quick facts in addition to what the ambassador has said. Population of, I think this is more than, I saw figures of 653 million. High proportion of which is comprised of the youth. High literacy rate, 7 out of 10 AMS exceeded 90%, with a combined GDP of $3 trillion in 2018. ASEAN is collectively ranked as the world's 5th largest economy. Next slide, please. Of course, COVID-19 has its impact, and it's quite significant. And we are revising our economic forecasts. So this is from the Asian Development Bank, which sees economic decline. Some even say it could be severe, caused by strict quarantines and travel restrictions. The ADB revised the projected sub-regional GDP down by nearly 5 percentage points to 3.8% contraction in 2020, with the forecast rebound revised up by nearly 1 point to 5.5% growth in 2021. So we have to deal with this. Economic recovery will continue to be slow and painful, largely determined by developments in world trade and the global economy. And of course, how long the pandemic would stay. Next slide, please. ASEAN, of course, is facing challenges in the new normal, and we have to do some things that are musts. So one of them would be digitization, and this has been started before, but the need has been to do it has been accelerated due to the pandemic. Physical distancing measures and the lockdowns accelerated the adoption of contactless engagement. Cyber crimes are also being opportunistic, escalating during the pandemic, and there's also abuse of social media for misinformation. So the issue of cybersecurity, issues of cybersecurity, and the need to narrow the digital gap are priorities of ASEAN, exacerbated by the pandemic. Next slide, please. This is one of the priorities of ASEAN in the new normal, which is connectivity. So the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, or MPAC 2025's vision, is to have a seamlessly and comprehensively connected and integrated ASEAN that will promote competitiveness, inclusiveness, and a greater sense of community. The efforts are focused on 5 strategic areas: sustainable infrastructure, digital innovation, seamless logistics, regulatory excellence, and people mobility. Next slide, please. We also have a focus on sub-regional arrangements. ASEAN's various programs, particularly on physical, institutional, and people-to-people connectivity and on poverty alleviation, have created a fertile environment for the development of sub-regional groupings such as the BIMP, IAGA, and the Greater Mekong sub-region as mechanisms for more balanced economic growth among neighboring countries, and also possible areas that could contribute more to the recovery because they have remained relatively less touched by the pandemic. We also have, we always mention the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity because of the importance of its mandate, growing importance of its mandate. It is the only center for excellence hosted by the Philippines, and with the onset of the pandemic, its mandate has been gaining weight. So right now, ACB is focusing on the environment, specifically zoonotic diseases and climate change issues. Also focusing on Philippine engagement in ASEAN, just to share with you that the ASEAN Tibet Council was just recently established, and the Philippines will be serving as inaugural chair from the period 2020 to 2022. So under the Philippines chairship, we are going to set the direction and plan of action on the priorities under Tibet. and of course engage external partners and international organizations for support to the ASEAN Tibet Council so that we'll have a more competitive human resource endowed with future-ready skills. Another priority of ASEAN is to uphold ASEAN's centrality in the regional security architecture. And the Indo-Pacific has been mentioned by previous speakers, and ASEAN has its own AOIP, ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. But before that, I'll just enumerate this, how do you say it, dashboard on the regional security architecture. So we have the ASEAN-led mechanisms, East Asia Summit, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and the ASEAN Regional Forum. Then we have the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And of course, we are working towards an effective and substantive code of conduct in the South China Sea. And we would like to have the RCEP. Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership signed by end of this year, and always enhanced engagement with external partners. So now let's go back to that slide, so I could elaborate one by one. During this time of global uncertainty, shifting geopolitical climate, and major power rivalry, we see ASEAN centrality as more relevant than ever. ASEAN's role in the regional security architecture amid power dynamics between and among external powers that have interests in the region is anchored in ASEAN centrality. Under this, ASEAN must play a central role in the multinational frameworks in the wider region. Despite ASEAN's limited material power, it upholds centrality as a node in a cluster of networks composed of ASEAN-led mechanisms, which include the following. I already mentioned EAS, EDMM+, and the ASEAN Regional Forum. On the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, it highlights ASEAN centrality again as the underlying principle for promoting cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. It reaffirms ASEAN's central role in the evolving regional architecture in Southeast Asia and beyond, and is consistent with ASEAN's principles of inclusiveness, consensus building, and a diplomatic rather than a military and/or strategic approach to issues affecting the region. The AOIP identifies 4 priority areas for cooperation, namely maritime cooperation, second is connectivity, third is economic and related areas, and fourth, the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. On the Code of Conduct, or COC, an effective COC and substantive COC that is consistent with international law, including UNCLOS, remains our goal. ASEAN, which has 4 claimant countries, will continue to be the hub of negotiations on SCS matters. We also look forward to the conclusion of RCEP. The Philippines is optimistic that RCEP will perform an invaluable role in the post-pandemic recovery of the region, including the creation of new supply chains that are more resilient and responsive to the unprecedented challenges posed by the pandemic. It's important to take advantage of ASEAN's convening power and its ability to engage external partners to drive recovery, peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. So we see ASEAN's partnerships as essential for advancing community building objectives amid the uncertainties brought about by COVID-19. So ASEAN in the new normal, the next slide please. Some prospects for the future, for the near future. We see ASEAN remaining as a significant forum for collective action on traditional and emerging issues. And like most crises, COVID-19 could be viewed as a test of ASEAN's relevance and the effectiveness of ASEAN response and recovery initiatives would be assessed and weighed, focusing on timeliness of response and agility in decision-making. It is still too early to measure the full extent of the impact of COVID-19 and the responses of individual countries and collective responses as well. But ASEAN has quickly adopted and responded to the pandemic. As to how present actions and response measures would contribute to recovery, this is still to be determined and the situation is still evolving. ASEAN also continues to play an important role in engaging with major powers. Here, ASEAN centrality is key. This is our mantra. Increasing accession to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, expanding partnerships and participation in ASEAN-led mechanisms such as the East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, and ADMM+, will continue to demonstrate ASEAN's convening power. As major powers compete, increasing tensions in the region, ASEAN is becoming more careful not to be entangled in such competition. This is the aspiration, but as to how we do this on the ground still remains to be seen. On the 53rd founding anniversary of ASEAN, the foreign ministers issued a statement on the importance of maintaining peace and stability in Southeast Asia amid geopolitical rivalry. And we can expect ASEAN to provide the needed pushback to challenges to the rule of law. The Philippines very much welcomes the growing number of states, a number of them among ASEAN's external partners, that are recognizing and highlighting the importance of the 2016 Arbitral Award. To us, this is an important development, not just for the Philippines cause, but also for the rule of law in general. It's still too early to embark on firm economic forecasts, but taking into consideration that ASEAN countries were relatively less affected, and hopefully it continues that way, by the pandemic, with much lower incidence and fatality rates compared to other regions, despite its proximity to China, and despite present uncertainties. Prospects for recovery could be good, provided of course that the pandemic is not prolonged and the right measures are put in place and promptly implemented. Lastly, ASEAN sees the need to build resilience for future emergencies through strengthened public health and social welfare systems, human capital development, financing in times of emergency, ensuring smooth supply chains, connectivity, digitization, green growth, and smart cities, among the many goals in its 2025 vision. The vision remains and takes on board the lessons learned from COVID-19. Thus, it will be a roadmap to a more resilient future. Thank you very much. Lumampas ba ako?
Good morning, everyone. Please stand by. We lost Professor Kraft's connection. Please stand by. Okay, good morning, everyone. Again, we're trying to have Professor Kraft come into the webinar. We're having some tech issues for his internet. But in the meantime, Professor Taylor, if you can come in and start with your presentation while we're waiting for Professor Kraft. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nika, and thank you for all of your help to organise today's session. And it's really a great pleasure and a great privilege to be part of such a distinguished panel here as part of this year's Katipunan Conference. So thank you very much to Professor Kraft and the Strategic Studies program at the University of Philippines for the invitation. I'll start by saying that even before the COVID-19 crisis struck earlier this year, a number of worrying strategic trends were already emerging in Asia. What the pandemic has done, in my view, is to bring at least three of those trends into much sharper relief. First, the willingness and the ability of the United States to continue underwriting Asia's security order, as it has largely done now for the better part of 7 decades, is increasingly in doubt. As Alan Gingell, a former head of our Office of National Assessments here in Australia, has recently observed, it is hard to think of a global crisis over the past 50 years to which Washington has offered the international community so little response. Now, it's true that no international order lasts forever, and it's likely that Asia's US-led version would have succumbed to this region's shifting power relativities eventually, particularly given the re-emergence of new power centers in China, in India, and possibly in Indonesia. However, the Trump administration's America First posture and the president's disdain for alliance relationships in particular has hastened the incumbent order's decline in my view. Secondly, the strategic bargain that Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong famously struck in the 1970s has now completely unraveled, and with it the engagement strategy that successive US administrations had hoped would help tame and ultimately transform China. Now, once again, this trajectory was already apparent prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated this deterioration in US-China relations, as evidenced by the near absence of Sino-American cooperation in response to it. This contrasts sharply with the experience of past crises, such as the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, where US-China cooperation was so positive that it prompted calls for the establishment of a US-China Group of Two, or G2. Today, however, calls for Sino-American decoupling only grow louder. And third, I'd argue that the pandemic will severely test Asian multilateralism. I very much appreciated the Assistant Secretary's remarks on ASEAN's response to the crisis, and I learned a great deal from those. However, I think it's fair to say that even before the pandemic struck, there was less optimism than there was perhaps a decade ago that Asia's multilateral groupings would be able to cope with a major crisis, and that it would be able to tame Asia's emerging power politics. My view is that the pandemic's severe economic effects will only further hamper these groupings. And I think it's worth us reflecting back to the aftermath of the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis, where the number of multilateral gatherings in this part of the world plummeted as many member states either couldn't meet or justify attendance costs. Now, none of these trends are irreversible. The pandemic's scale and severity could yet convince Beijing and Washington, and especially a Biden administration, of the need to cooperate on global challenges such as climate change. And they could potentially seek to do so even through new or reimagined multilateral fora. But hope is never a strategy, and the post-COVID-19 world is more likely, in my view, to become a significantly darker, disconnected, and ultimately more dangerous place. And in such a world, the importance of military power and the risk of major conflict will almost certainly increase. I should make very clear here that I don't think anybody craves such a conflict, not least because of the destructive power of the weaponry involved. And for that reason, I don't buy some of the speculation going around at present that Xi Jinping plans to invade Taiwan before the end of this year. What I worry far more about is the risk of inadvertent escalation of events spiraling out of control. As Asia becomes more contested, this region's militaries are operating in increasingly close proximity, most notably at present in the Taiwan Strait and along the Sino-Indian border. As some leading commentators have argued that such encounters almost never escalate into full-blown conflict. The American strategic observer Hal Brands, for instance, wrote just this August that while a contemporary US-China conflict is possible, should one erupt, it will not be the product of an accident or inadvertence. In his words, there is no more monumental decision than to initiate a major conflict. So when countries really do want to avert a showdown, they are generally willing to tack or retreat, even at the cost of some embarrassment. Yet three features of Asia's unfolding geopolitics, I would contend, suggest that such arguments are too optimistic. Firstly, Northeast Asia in particular remains home to virulent and deep-seated nationalist sentiments, which stretch back centuries and that are never far beneath the surface of Asia's geopolitical rivalries. Rising nationalism, of course, has long been recognized as a powerful driver of major power conflict, most notably as the leading cause of the First World War. Simultaneously, as a region that is home to many relatively new nation states, especially in Southeast and South Asia, Asia's domestic politics are inherently fragile and unpredictable. The possibility of Southeast Asia in particular reverting to its more fractious, crisis-prone past is one that cannot be discounted either, particularly against the backdrop of lingering bilateral mistrust across this sub-region. Second, due to advances in military technologies, the pathways to major power conflict will not be as linear nor as predictable as those of previous eras, such as the Cold War. The so-called fire breaks between conventional and nuclear capabilities that were core to the maintenance of strategic stability during that period are increasingly blurred due to the proliferation of dual use, i.e. nuclear and conventional missile systems. The pace of modern weaponry has also increased as a result of advances in hypersonics, whose speed and maneuverability can defeat any currently deployed missile shield. Added to this, the vulnerability of modern militaries, and especially the sophisticated network of systems, the radars, the sonars, and the satellites that they employ to track an opponent's movements, only heighten the military technical incentives to escalate rapidly in a deepening crisis or conflict scenario. Third, history is full of examples where decision makers, often by their own admission, have genuinely lost control of events in the heat of a crisis. Just because such instances did not escalate into full-blown conflict previously does not guarantee that such will remain the case in future. The October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis offers the best example here, where the leaders of the US and the Soviet Union were not always in full control, and where luck, as much as adept crisis diplomacy, played a role in averting nuclear catastrophe. Now, of course, that close call convinced Moscow and Washington of the need for more robust crisis management machinery, including a hotline connecting the Kremlin and the Pentagon, and later an incidents at sea agreement designed to reduce the risk of dangerous interaction where their navies were operating in close proximity. Yet precisely when such mechanisms are now needed most in Asia, they are either atrophying or are no longer fit for purpose. The military confidence building measures agreed to by Beijing and New Delhi during the 1990s have been insufficient to prevent the outbreak of deadly violence along the Sino-Indian border in 2020. The cross-strait hotline agreed to by Taipei and Beijing in November 2015 now lies dormant. North Korea has walked away from many of the crisis management and avoidance mechanisms that it agreed to during the brief inter-Korean peace process of 2018 and 2019, as evidenced by Pyongyang's destruction of the Kaesong Liaison Office in June of this year. But the time is ripe, I would argue, for a serious reinvigoration and possibly even some reimagining of this region's crisis management and avoidance mechanisms. To be sure, it's easy to throw up one's hands here and to despair that Beijing's apparent disregard for such measures inevitably makes such a futile exercise. Yet the Cold War experience shows that even ideologically disparate governments can be convinced to forge and to adhere to such arrangements when these are perceived to be in their self-interest. In conclusion, and as Asia's and indeed the world's leaders now seek to rebuild their economies and their societies in the wake of the havoc wreaked by COVID-19, they might usefully reflect upon some of the lessons offered by the pandemic and their potential applicability in the strategic realm. If they could step back in time, I suspect many leaders would wish that they had acted earlier to contain the pandemic when they had the chance. Further, those societies which have thus far navigated the COVID-19 crisis most successfully have managed to do so by putting in place stringent protective measures such as mask wearing, rigorous testing and tracing regimes, and social distancing regulations. To the extent that crisis management and avoidance mechanisms can be seen as the strategic equivalent of such measures, they should now be pursued with the utmost urgency in Asia to reduce the risk of an even greater catastrophe. Thank you very much for listening today. I'll hand back to Herman and very much look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. We have a very varied set of presentations before us, or at least we can actually talk about ranges of perceptions or perspectives that are presented here. Now, on one hand, you have questions about the need to actually increase the effectiveness of multilateral arrangements, as well as the different measures that are needed in order to continue dialogue and maintain the current regional architecture. But at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you have warnings about the effects of great power relations, and the dangers that this actually pose to the region. We had Ambassador Riefenstuhl actually talking about the idea of Germany's initiative regarding the policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific, where she actually emphasized the points that we talked about regarding Germany's initiatives, regarding the need to actually maintain and strengthen economic relations to the extent that it both increases bilateral arrangements as well as multilateral ones. But at the same time, there is also the danger, the warnings given about the effects on regional security of the changing strategic environment. And to this end, she actually talked about the need to come up with a fully fledged strategic partnership arrangement between the EU, as well as the ASEAN, which Germany is actually going to be very much supportive of. Especially as far as trying to cope with issues that have to do with COVID-19, climate change, as well as economic cooperation. This, to a large extent, actually coincides with what Assistant Secretary Mahilum West was actually talking about, as far as ASEAN is concerned, with the emphasis on the idea of intensifying cooperation within ASEAN, with the emphasis on trying to strengthen ASEAN centrality, and the need to actually push forward the idea of ASEAN mechanisms, especially as far as a recovery framework, in response to the COVID-19 issue. The commitment to ASEAN 2025, actually, and what we actually find in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific tells us, how much the aspirational aspects, and normative aspects of ASEAN's convening role, which was actually mentioned by Assistant Secretary Mahilum West, is still very much an important part of this whole thing. There's a lot of convergence, as far as strengthening multilateralism, especially on issues that have to do with questions of climate change, and connectivity. In this context, I think we find that in the presentations of Ambassador Rivalry and Assistant Secretary Mahilim West, the importance of continued strengthening of multilateral cooperation across the region, which actually puts us now into the context of what Professor Taylor was actually is pointing out, that all of these things are taking place within the context of an intensifying rivalry between the most powerful states in the region right now. And this can be seen in terms of the relationship between China and the United States, which actually covers and how this has actually become much more competitive as opposed to being more cooperative. And this ranges from questions that have to do with economic relations, to political security ones. And in this context, the issues that he points to is, of course, the extent to which this creates the environment within which unforeseen events might actually escalate into into greater levels of conflicts. Although he does actually tell us that to a large extent there are mechanisms that are in place to try to slow down the effects of those kinds of situations. But the point here, I think, that we can see in these three presentations is that there is a lot of unpredictability, not necessarily coming from COVID-19 directly. I think the Ambassador Rivalry actually pointed out that this already existed prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what is actually interesting is the extent to which these conditions are actually becoming part of the way that we are trying to imagine what the next few months, what a post-COVID, we're not yet in a post-COVID-19 situation, but what it might actually look like given the kinds of conditions that we're actually facing here. Now, we have a lot of points to consider as far as the presentations are actually concerned. And so at this point, I will now open up the floor for questions. And let me try to raise a few as more questions are actually being posted. Let me post these questions to the three speakers. For Ambassador Rivalry, the question that comes to mind is, you emphasize the aspect where Germany will try to actually push forward an EU initiative as far as strengthening a fully fledged strategic partnership between the EU and ASEAN. The question that comes to mind here is, or at least maybe this is more impressionistic than anything else, is the extent to which the EU might actually be behind, completely behind this kind of situation, given the kinds of dynamics that are actually taking place within the EU, Brexit notwithstanding and all the other things. So the question is, to what extent do you see this initiative as gaining traction, and therefore becoming part of the agenda, in discussions between the EU and ASEAN? Ambassador Rivalry.
Thank you very much. You gave a part of the answer already yourself, I assume. I mean, our efforts, our meaning EU, Germany, and EU efforts to scale up to the relations between the EU and ASEAN into a a strategic partnership or a closer partnership has come from a long time. I mean, we have seen that ASEAN is of increasing importance, and is the structures of ASEAN, and as it has been illustrated by Assistant Secretary Junifer, the structures and institutions ASEAN is establishing just show the growing importance of ASEAN, the growing importance of the region, and the outreach ASEAN has done over the past years into the region, more or less, has created strategic partnerships with important partners that then have led to institutionalizing the dialogue and the cooperation. And with the EU, there has been a lot of cooperation going on in the past, but not this kind of institutionalizing it and making it something of bring it into the DNA of both of EU and ASEAN, that we are partners that we should always have on our radar. There is ASEAN or there is EU. We should discuss this with this partner, or whatever aspect it might be it climate related issues, be it COVID, be it trade, whatever. And this is an ongoing effort. So scaling up the partnership into a strategic one is a mutual effort and is an ongoing effort. It's not something that, at least not what we intend, to have something signed on paper, put it on the shelf and stating we are strategic partners now, but this is something that needs to grow from the cooperation and from the constant and continuous dialogue.
Thank you, Excellency. Assistant Secretary Mahilum West, there's a question that's actually posed for you, and this has to do with the question or the idea of ASEAN's plan to address cybersecurity issues that are detrimental to fighting COVID-19. This has to do with misinformation in social media, for instance, as one. In other words, could you elaborate on what ASEAN's plans are as far as cybersecurity is concerned, especially when it comes to opposing misinformation regarding the approach to COVID-19? Ma'am, muted pa ho kayo?
I unmuted it already here. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, sorry for that. The overall framework here is cybersecurity, and it's a new emerging issue being addressed by ASEAN. We are refining our institutional, capacity to deal with the issue. Firstly, we established a new coordinating mechanism on cybersecurity, because what happened before was that cybersecurity was treated by so many bodies, and we saw the need to coordinate efforts on this topic. So that one is going to meet, the new coordinating mechanism is going to meet before the year ends to set its directions. And on fake news or misinformation in media, we also established a subcommittee on information under our senior officials meeting responsible for information. So these are emerging issues that we are addressing. And of course, we will be engaging with the partners as well in our efforts.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. For Dr. Taylor, there are a number of questions that are actually being posed for you. Let me try to summarize them. The first one actually has to do with your reference to inadvertent escalation, and the question has to do with what do you have any ideas on or recommendations on what measures, specific measures or pursuits could actually be undertaken region-wide now in order to make sure that there isn't this slide that takes place because of unforeseen issues. Secondly, there's this question that has to do with the reference to how much the strategic environment in Southeast Asia has become darker and disconnected in a post-pandemic or in this pandemic situation. And the question is, do you see ASEAN playing a role, and having the capability to be able to actually address this particular issue? And finally, a third question, still to Dr. Taylor. How would you consider, or what would you consider as possible game changers which may increase the propensity of conflict in the region, particularly in the flashpoints that you actually mentioned? So the question is, what might actually intensify the possibility of these flashpoints becoming flashpoints? So, Dr. Taylor?
Thanks very much, Professor Kraft. Those are three excellent questions. I'll try to keep my answers fairly brief. On the first of those questions, what are some region-wide measures that could be put in place? I mean, as you know, there have been some region-wide measures previously, such as in the 2014 Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which offers a potential template for all those types of region-wide measures. As the Assistant Secretary said, there's also the ongoing negotiations over the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea. I think those are, very promising developments. My view is that with these sorts of measures, that often, given the diversity of the region and given the difficulty that there often is to get agreement on these measures or consensus on these measures, sometimes agreeing to them bilaterally is possibly a more viable way to go, at least in the short term. I'm thinking here of the example of the communication mechanism that the Chinese and the Japanese have established that took about a decade to negotiate, but now seems to be operating fairly effectively to try and reduce the risk of accidental clashes in the East China Sea. So having said that, I think regional groupings can try and encourage or convince disputing parties to enter into those sorts of agreements, try and encourage them along. So I think that there is still a role for multilateral groupings in this process, even if the agreements themselves end up being bilateral in nature. On the second question about Southeast Asia being more darker and disconnected, I think I suppose what I'm referring to there is more the larger strategic environment, and particularly the US-China relationship. I think even before the pandemic, there was talk about a US-China decoupling. I don't think that we're going to see a complete decoupling. I think in some areas like the financial interdependence, for instance, between the United States and China, would make a complete decoupling very difficult. But I think that in other areas, in technology, we're already seeing quite a lot of technological decoupling in that area. I think that overall there'll be the US-China relationship, even under a Biden administration, is likely going forward to be a more difficult relationship. And I think that the rest of us in the region, to some extent, are going to feel the effects of that. So that's kind of what I mean in terms of a darker, more disconnected region. It's more that what I see is the relations between the great powers and how that's going to impact upon the rest of us in the region. Once again, I think that there is a role for ASEAN in responding to that, but a lot will depend, and I agree very much with the Assistant Secretary that there's so much uncertainty about what the impact of the pandemic is going to be economically across the region. And I think the absolute impact, but also the relative impact, how that impacts perhaps on some states, on some societies more than others, could have an impact upon how disconnected the region as a whole becomes, and how effectively ASEAN is able to respond to these challenges. In terms of possible game changers, What I worry about is as we see, you know, military forces coming into close proximity, what I worry about is an incident that kind of just happens at the wrong place or the wrong time that then spirals out of control in the absence of robust enough crisis management mechanisms to be able to control that. And, you know, as a concrete example, I think back to an incident that occurred on the 1st of July 2016, where there was a Taiwanese destroyer was parked in port in Kaohsiung and accidentally fired an anti-shipping missile in the direction of mainland China. And fortunately, that missile hit a Taiwanese fishing boat, or fortunately for everyone apart from the captain of that boat. But if that event had happened exactly 5 years later, on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, in that kind of nationalistically charged atmosphere, and in the absence of any kind of formal crisis management mechanisms, as you would know, there are informal crisis management mechanisms across Australia. Could that event have been contained? That's the sort of event I worry about, or say a version of the EP3 collision that happened back in April 2001, but where a Chinese jet fighter and a US surveillance aircraft clashed. Could an event like that could it be contained in the current environment of US-China relations? It's those sorts of events and the lack of machinery to kind of navigate through those events that worries me most.
We have two other questions. One for Assistant Secretary Mahilum West. You stated that the ASEAN is careful not to be entangled in the major powers competition. I think this has to do with the idea of not taking any sides. You know, but do you see ASEAN being capable of remaining outside of, or if it is going to be engaged, in what way can it be engaged as far as that competition is actually concerned? And for Ambassador Riefenstahl, there's this question having to do with, I think, in connection with ASEAN, or working with ASEAN, whether, and I guess this related to the question to Assistant Secretary Mahilum West, you know, can the EU, through Germany's chairmanship and working with ASEAN, do you see this particular partnership actually playing a role in the complex geopolitical challenges, you know, that are taking place within the region, China, US, no, South China Sea, and all those kinds of issue? Or is this something that you see as being outside of that particular notion of that strategic partnership? Assistant Secretary Mahilum West. Ma'am, you're still
Fine
muted.
power. Okay. Okay, sound is okay? Okay, great. First question was on what ASEAN aspires to do in the middle of an intensifying power rivalry in the region. As I've said, we don't want to be entangled, and we don't want to be, how do you say it, client states. We don't want to be proxies. That's the aspiration. But we have to consider as well the extent of relations with these powers and ASEAN member states. So they are very important economic, security, strategic partners. And not to mention, I mean, the whole gamut of relations is very active, people-to-people contacts as well. So that's why I said that as to how it's going to play out on the ground, how this aspiration is going to be achieved remains to be seen. Because we cannot disregard that certain countries are closer to certain powers than others. So we have to take that into consideration. if we are to realistically assess what's going to happen in the future.
Ambassador Reifenstuhl?
Thank you very much. A very interesting question and a bit challenging. What is sometimes a bit misleading is a wrong analogy or a wrong comparison between EU and ASEAN. EU and ASEAN are both regional forms of cooperation and dialogue, or even institutionalizing, but the EU is a kind of European EU joint institution where the member states refer responsibilities or certain areas of political or economic issues to the EU and don't deal with them themselves. So something can only be done with the EU, but not with the member state of the EU when it comes to a country of ASEAN. Let's say a free trade agreement, something like this. Whereas ASEAN is important as a regional forum for dialogue and exchange of position and of finding common positions. Even if this kind of referring certain areas of responsibility to the institution as such is not the same as we do have with in the EU. But at the same time, there are areas that are of high relevance to all member states of ASEAN, be it the South China Sea, or most of the ASEAN member states, be it the South China Sea issue, or be it the impact of the climate change. So this forum of ASEAN is something where you can address or discuss and address certain issues and find certain joint solutions, like with the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, or the ASEAN Center for Humanitarian Assistance, which enhances the cooperation in certain areas without being forced to do everything jointly. And this is a very interesting approach and concept for the EU, to have this dialogue partner to engage in the discussion and in the dialogue that is taking place among the ASEAN member states.
Madam Ambassador, a very quick follow-up. In your talk, you actually emphasized quite a bit the idea of cooperating on issues that have to do with climate change. I thought that was actually quite interesting in terms of how you actually repeatedly pointed this out. Could you help us in terms of the thinking around, are there any specific initiatives that might be of interest to Germany as far as the policy guidelines and the way that this might actually find its way in the dialogue between the EU and ASEAN on that strategic partnership? Oh, you're still muted, Madam Ambassador. Sorry.
Sorry. This is something which I might probably illustrate rather on a bilateral level, or on the German, not EU level, since we have a very interesting policy priority on climate change that has led to the providing of funds for climate change related measures and projects and programs. It's called International Climate Initiative, and we are working with countries around the world that are being heavily affected by the climate change, by the impacts of climate change. This initiative has been launched I think more than 5 years ago, and in the course of since the program started, there have been several countries being identified that as priority partners or priority countries, and the Philippines is one of them. So, which means that the climate change programs is one of our focus areas or priority areas for cooperation with several institutions, with authorities, with Philippine authorities, be it the NEDA or the Climate Change Commission, but also with NGOs or with other partners working in this area in order to address the impact of climate change, but not only for the Philippines as a single country, but also with a regional approach. There are countries, there are programs and projects that have a broader approach that bring together 5 or 4 or 5 countries and are still going under this climate change initiative, bringing together 4 or 5 countries in the region, so Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, so whatever is the focus of the project. So this is a very interesting but also very successful approach we have taken over the past years.
Thank you very much. I have one last question for Professor Taylor, but this is an opportunity for me to actually invite Professor Taylor to actually give his final thoughts as far as this webinar is concerned. And then I will also ask Assistant Secretary Mahilum West and Ambassador Riefenstahl to actually give their final sets of thoughts on today's discussions. Professor Taylor, there is a question here that actually has to do with your points about the US-Sino tensions that have intensified with the pandemic. And I think this is connected to the points that you were making, as well as the book that you wrote a few years back regarding the flashpoints in the region. And this has to do with the question of how much have these hotspots or these flashpoints become hotter, so to speak, as hotspots, and the extent to which you might actually say that the prospect for conflict, although you did point out in your talk that the mechanisms are there for slowing down a slide, so to speak, into an inadvertent escalation. But to what extent can you actually say that the overall regional security situation, is becoming hotter? And if it is, how can we actually reverse or improve that particular situation? And then after this, I will also ask Assistant Secretary Mahilum West and Ambassador Riefenstahl for their final comments as well. Professor Taylor?
Thank you very much, Professor Kraft. And another excellent question. I mean, one of the things that I've found at looking at these various flashpoints over the years is at different points in time, some of the flashpoints tend to heat up and others cool down. It's never a static situation. And I think even since I wrote the book, I think tensions on the Sino-Indian border have really heated up to a much greater extent. I think if I was ever to do another version of the book, I might have to change its title from the 4 flashpoints to the 5 flashpoints, because it's what's happened this year on the Sino-Indian border is really really quite a worrying sign of what's to come. I think the other flashpoint that's really heated up and is quite worrying at present is the Taiwan flashpoint. So those are the two that I really worry about, and that I think have got hotter. Unfortunately, I think the kind of the crisis management and avoidance mechanisms are probably least robust or least well developed in those cases, or most in need of an updating in those cases compared with the others. So that's makes those 2 flashpoints doubly worrying. Just in terms of a closing thoughts or remarks, I just wanted to thank you very much, Herman, for bringing us together. I mean, one of the silver linings to the pandemic has been that the ability to conduct these virtual meetings where we otherwise wouldn't be able to. And I for one have learned a great deal today. I especially appreciated the Assistant Secretary's presentation, and there's a lot going on in terms of what ASEAN is doing that I wasn't aware of. So I very much appreciated that today, and thank you for bringing us all together so that we could have that this discussion, Herman.
Thank you, Brendan. That was very nice of you. can I ask Assistant Secretary Mahilim West for her final thoughts? Ma'am, you're still muted. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you once again to Professor Kraft and to the UP-CIDS and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines for inviting me to this webinar today. It's an honor to be speaking alongside Her Excellency Ambassador Anke Reifenstuhl of Germany and Professor Brendan Taylor of Australian National University on such a weighty topic. I am grateful for the opportunity to be able to discuss the Philippines' participation in ASEAN, especially during these challenging times owing to the pandemic. As I've said, it may be too early to assess the performance of the organization during this critical period, but we are witness to how ASEAN has adapted to the challenges of this crisis, adjusting its goals and tweaking its ways to properly and efficiently respond to the problem at hand. The importance of multilateralism and institutions like ASEAN is highlighted even further by crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. The lessons of the pandemic remind us of the need to work together, to stick together, to address issues that recognize no borders. States may be engaged in actions in pursuit of national interests, but the lessons of ASEAN show us that they can also pursue collective interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. And thank you very much for participating in this webinar. Madam Ambassador, can we have your final thoughts now?
Thank you very much. I can only repeat what has been said, that I really found the exchange and the meeting we had today very useful and a very fruitful exchange, something to log onto and to continue and to follow up upon, which I will certainly do with the Assistant Secretary Junifer. I found our positioning that are drafted and stated in the Indo-Pacific policy guidelines confirm that we are right in our outreach to the Indo-Pacific and the Asia region, and also right in making it a priority in our foreign policy. What I found also confirmed in the meeting is the relevance, the growing relevance of ASEAN, and the growing relevance of ASEAN being a partner of Germany's foreign policy and of Europe. And therefore, I'm really looking forward to intensifying the cooperation with the DFA and with the Philippines, since the Philippines will be taking over the role of the coordinator for the EU-ASEAN relationships in a few months. Which will bring our which will make our cooperation even closer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Reifenstuhl. And again, I think this ends the substantive part of our discussion. It only remains for me to thank you all, for number one, to thank our speakers for joining in today's discussion, for their incredible contributions to the topic that we had here today. Especially giving us some set of notions about where we might actually be heading, and how we might be reading the tea leaves or coffee crumbs, as some would actually point out. And thank you as well to our audience. We hope that in participating in this webinar, that you were able to gain new insights, as far as the issues are actually concerned. And now, just an important reminder for our participants who requested for an e-certificate of attendance to please refer to the Zoom access email sent to you by the Strategic Studies program. for instructions on how to get one for this panel. On behalf of the organizers of the 5th Katipunan Conference, thank you once again to our panelists and attendees for joining us, and especially to those who have been with us since day one of this webinar series. This has been your moderator, Herman. Thank you, and please stay safe. Thank you very much.